When it comes to the modern fairy tale, you'll find very few movies as universally beloved as The Princess Bride, at least in live action. The extremely wholesome story of a stable boy's determination to be reunited with his one true love and save her from an evil prince. This film might even be what most think of when they hear the phrase fairy tale movie. And today, I'd like to go over The Princess Bride and explain what makes it one of the best told fairy tales in more modern memory, despite almost not being that way. And needless to say, there will be spoilers ahead, so in case you haven't seen this movie yet and don't want to know how it ends, do yourself a favor and come back after you have seen it. Alright. So to cut right to the chase, the biggest reason why The Princess Bride works so well as a fairy tale is because it not only understands everything that appeals to people about such stories, but isn't afraid to play them straight either. And this is perhaps best exemplified by the framing device being a grandfather reading the story to his grandson, and how the grandson goes from being uninterested to extremely invested in the narrative, which is exactly how many who are watching it for the first time might be apt to feel. Annoyed with themselves that they decided to watch what's seemingly going to be 1,001 fantasy cliches before getting extremely wrapped up in what the story has to offer. Because while it might not be the most original in nature, in this case that's exactly why it works so well. I mean, a prince and a princess, star-crossed lovers who have to beat impossible odds to be together, the fantasy landscapes and animals, a revenge quest, pirates, giants, a damsel in distress, sword fights, a legendary story told within the story. These are all things that are associated with fairy tales, and the movie not only has all of them, but incorporates them perfectly so that they don't feel tiresome, cliche, or forced. And this is where later attempts at capturing the spirit of fairy tales would fail, because as I went on at length about in my video on Tangled, which you can find a link in the description to, in this day and age, many writers are afraid to play most elements found in fairy tales straight, either out of a fear of being seen as unoriginal or that said elements have become dated. But as long as one doesn't fall into the obvious pitfalls, fairy tale stories do, and most definitely should, still have a place in movies today. And instead of trying to tear them down in a desperate attempt to be seen as clever or edgy, or by parodying them, the best ones will always be the ones that play it straight, just as The Princess Bride and many of Disney's best movies did. But one thing that must be noted about The Princess Bride is the sheer level of commitment it has to playing everything associated with fairy tales straight, while still managing to feel like something that could have only been made in the modern age. Because sure, the setting might be some mythical land in the past, but nobody is going to believe that this is actually an adaptation of a classic fairy tale written centuries ago. It's a fairy tale written for the current year, and the fact that it manages to strike the perfect balance between modern and fairy tale is what makes it one of the best of its kind, because it knows its audience. It knows what its audience loves about fairy tales, and uses that knowledge to deliver a movie that's both an ode to classic fairy tales, while also being its own unique take on them, and in the process manages to capture both the inner child and hopeless romantic inside of us all. But the irony here is that its ability to perfectly capture the feeling of a fairy tale wasn't actually intended on the writer's part, because when it was written, The Princess Bride was actually meant to be a parody of classic fairy tale stories. And when examined a little closer, its original intent is actually somewhat evident, as it is funnier than a traditional fairy tale, and contains such things as villainous henchmen who are only in it for the money and end up joining the good guys, which is not a common occurrence in fairy tales, features the prince as the bad guy, as well as just how straight Inigo Montoya's revenge against Count Rugen is played. I mean, when you actually watch the scene, it almost comes across as if the movie already knows that his iconic line is going to become so popular. And perhaps most notably, there's the romance between Buttercup and Wesley, who go on and on about how endlessly they love and can't live without each other, and yet, when they're actually together, they spend about 90% of their screen time arguing, which was meant to satirize how often in fairy tales two characters would fall hopelessly in love even when they are completely incompatible with each other. But by the time filming had finished, the script had turned from a blatant parody of fairy tales to something more resembling a love letter to them. Now, part of this can be chalked up to what I had mentioned earlier, specifically how well the movie understood what's appealing about fairy tales and how straight it played them, whether seriously or for laughs. It understood what it was satirizing so well that the satire ended up almost completely lost. But the biggest reason for the movie's shift from a parody into a straight fairy tale everybody knows and loves is often said to be the actors' performances. They play their parts with such a complete sincerity that it's almost impossible to recognize the satirical nature that was originally intended. In other words, instead of playing their roles to mock the archetypes they're playing, as is usually done in parody movies, the actors play their parts with extreme affection, sincerity, and joy. And as a result, the audience can't help but take everything they're seeing at face value and love it right alongside them. Heck, this is even true for the grandfather and grandson. What could have easily been much more blatantly satirical instead easily comes across as the genuine bonding experience the movie presents it as. But while all the actors definitely deserve praise in this department, special mention has to go to Cary Elves and Robin Wright. Because, as already mentioned, originally the dynamic between Wesley and Buttercup was meant to highlight how incompatible they were against how much they insist they love each other. But Elves and Wright's natural chemistry, which was definitely helped along by the fact that the two really were smitten with each other during filming, almost single-handedly changed all of that. Because simply put, the two effortlessly sell the fact that they love each other as much as they say they do, and thus the arguing that's meant to satirize their relationship instead comes across as a result of their circumstances and not something they would normally do were they free to live happily. And considering The Princess Bride is indeed considered one of the most famous romantic movies out there, and that many have called their relationship goal, one can't deny that actors really can go a long way in shaping how the audience perceives their characters. Now, to be fair here, it's not like the movie was written as a Mel Brooks level satire and the editors found themselves with the much more traditional fairy tale we all have today, and is a lot more likely that slight alterations were made after it was realized that the movie worked better being played straight without the intended irony. Because let's face it, all of the actors' performances, and especially the chemistry between Wesley and Buttercup, was way too good to pass up. And the fact that it's considered one of the best fairy tale based movies ever made speaks for itself. But once again, while the actors' performances do have a lot to do with it, as they not only understand they're in a fairy tale, but absolutely love every second of it, the fact that the writers understood fairy tales so well and how to use the various elements in them to their fullest advantage is another big reason why the film works so well, even if it was originally intended to be more satirical in nature. Because as I already talked about in another video, which you can also find a link in the description to, and as a person who's written his fair share of books, understanding what you're going to write about and why it works and is appealing to people is an absolute must if a story is going to work. And that, along with the actors' committed performances, are two of the biggest reasons why The Princess Bride still ranks among the best fairy tale movies ever made, and perhaps one of the best examples of a more modern interpretation of them out there. Alright, I think that ends this video. So now why don't all of you tell me? Do you believe that The Princess Bride is the perfect example of everything that a fairy tale based movie should be? And a major reason for that is because of how well the writers understood fairy tales? Or have you seen other movies that you believe have done the whole thing better? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please keep in mind that you do not have to agree with anything I said in this video if you don't want to. You can feel about The Princess Bride and even fairy tales however you want to, and if you think I had it all wrong, that is totally okay. And thank you all for watching. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.